In this video, I'd like to show you a few of the more advanced operations of the table saw. To demonstrate these operations, I'm going to make a picture frame. I'm going to make a box with an inset bottom and a lid. These videos are not only meant to demonstrate how the table saw can be used in different ways, especially when we take off the safety guard and lower the blade so that we don't cut all the way through the board. But it's also going to demonstrate order of operations and the way that you can save yourself some time by doing certain things in a certain order. You'll see what I mean. So let's get started with the table saw. The first thing I'm going to do is make a bunch of rip cuts to cut the sides of my boxes and the stock of my frames all to be the same dimensions. So right off the bat, to do this project, I'm going to run into a problem with the table saw as is in the first video that I shot. And if you haven't watched the basic table saw operations video, you need to go and watch that first and then watch this video. So the problem that I'm going to run into is that I want to cut my frame stock for my picture frames to be 7/8 of an inch in both directions. I'm just going to make a square stock for my frames. But when I slide the fence over towards the blade, at 1.25 inches, it starts to bump the safety mechanism. Now, I could lift this up and get a little closer, but it still bumps here in the back, and I wouldn't be able to get my push stick through there, and I certainly wouldn't want to put my hand in there to try and get between the blade and the fence. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to remove this safety mechanism and set it off to the side. Now, there's a very important thing behind the blade of the table saw that you will notice that looks like a black metal claw, and it comes up behind the blade and sort of mimics the curve of the blade, and that is called the riving knife. There's a riving knife built into the safety guard here that includes those teeth that lock into place to keep you from getting a kickback. Now, since we're going to remove this, we need to add in the other riving knife that does not have the safety guard on it. Now that riving knife, the function of that is to keep the board from slipping around at an angle. That's what could cause a kickback. However, the riving knife that I'm going to put in here does not have the teeth that keep the board from backing out. So I'm going to have to be extra careful of not having a kickback when I'm doing this operation. So let's go ahead and switch that out. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove the plate from around the blade, and I'm going to raise the blade up as high as I can so that it's easy to get in there and access the release handle for the safety guard. I'm also going to make sure that the table saw is unplugged so that there's no possible way. It's off, the system is off, there's really no way that it could hurt me, but just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and unplug it. Now once the foot is off, you can look down inside the table saw and there's a very obvious lever. And if you pull that towards you, it releases the safety mechanism. Now, since we have this over the top vacuum hose that connects to our safety guard, you have to just swing the whole thing out of the way, which is much easier than dismantling it. Once you've done that, you can then put the riving knife without the safety mechanism back down inside the saw and then push that lever back down to secure the riving knife in behind the blade. What this will let us do is it'll let us make cuts with the fence much closer to the blade. It'll also let us make cuts where the blade does not come all the way up through the top of the board. All right, so now I can get my fence all the way over to that 7/8 of an inch mark that I want. And since I'm ripping wood that's not much more than 1 inch in any direction, I'm going to lower that blade back down until it is only sticking up out of the table about 1.25 inches. So a little bit taller than my wood. That's good right there. So now I'm pretty well ready to run these through, except this one piece that I'm about to run through is pretty long. And that's easy enough to feed it in. But when it comes out the other side, it's going to do a couple of things. One is it's going to bump the work table over there on the other side of the room, which is going to prevent me from finishing my cut. And if I don't pay attention to that, I'm going to get trapped, where the wood is going to be trapped in the table saw with it running, and I'm going to have to reach down and turn the saw off while holding that wood in place with the push stick. That is a classic way of getting a kickback and getting hurt. So I'm going to have to release the locking brakes on that work table over there and roll it a little bit the other direction so that I can get this long board all the way through. The other thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to set up my outfeed roller to catch this board. Now I'm going to do several cuts on this, not just ripping it to size, but I'm also going to make a couple cuts where I take a corner out of it, and that's how it'll turn into a picture frame. So I have to get all set up to do that. Now the other thing that I'm concerned about is this is a pretty skinny little board, and any wiggle one direction or the other and I'll get a bad cut. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to set up a feather board. That will help me to keep the wood against the fence nice and snug, and I don't have to worry about it so much, and I can just worry about feeding it through the saw with my hands and then eventually with my push stick. Something to note about using a feather board. You always want the feather board to be just before the blade. You don't want it to be at the blade, because then you'll be pushing on the wrong part of the wood. You'll be pushing on the cutoff. And you certainly don't want it after the blade, because that's not really going to do anything. You want that feather board to be set up before the blade, and you should set that all up and tighten it long before you ever start cutting. To set up the feather board, the first thing I want to do is I want to set the fence to the measurement that I know I'm going to need it at. Then I'm going to drop the blade down inside the machine so that I can just set the board right there against the fence like this. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slide the feather board in here. It goes this direction, so the sort of comb of the feather board should point outward, and it's really the only way that you could put it in there. And this is kind of a funky little system. You have to unscrew these two, and it needs to be in this groove. And then what you would want to do is push with a little bit, not too much, but a little bit of force against your piece of wood, and while you're holding it there, tighten these two bolts. And what that does is it spreads out this little piece of metal and keeps the comb tight inside that groove so that it can't move around. There. For some reason, I can't get it tight enough. Okay, so now when I shove that board through, this is keeping my piece of wood securely against the fence. And you'll notice that, as I said before, the feather board is positioned just in front of the blade where it's going to start cutting. I'm about at 1 3/8 inches, which is a little high. Drop it down a little bit. And now my rollers are set up, my outfeed roller is set up, my feather board is set up, I have the right measurement and the right depth of blade, and I'm ready to start ripping my stock down for my picture frame. Okay, so I'm finished ripping down my 2 pieces of stock, and they are 7/8 of an inch square, maybe a tiny bit less, maybe 13/16 of an inch square. The next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to take the one corner out so that I make a profile for a picture frame. If you think about a picture frame, it's kind of shaped like an L, and so I want to take that corner out of these 2 pieces of wood so that I have the sort of front and side of the picture frame. Now, one thing that I want to point out is I haven't mitered these or cut them to length yet. I just have 2 really long pieces of wood, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my long plunge cuts to remove that corner first. And then after I do that, I'll miter these to be the right dimensions of the frame that I want. So that simple step of doing these long cuts first before I miter everything is going to save me a lot of time. That way I don't have to pass a whole bunch of short pieces over the table saw. I can just do it in basically 4 cuts, 2 on each board. Now the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to figure out my measurements for how much of the corner I want to remove. And then I'm going to drop the blade down inside the saw so that it's only sticking up as far as I want to cut into the board. Now, when I pass this piece of wood over the table saw and it's set up like that, you won't see the blade come out the one side of the wood. I don't want it to cut all the way through. I only want it to cut part of the way through. So I'm basically going to cut a groove in one side of the wood, then I'm going to turn it and I'm going to do that again. And when I do it again, then we'll have that little loose corner will come out. This is also a very important moment to use the featherboard, and I'm probably going to set it up twice. One distance for the thickness between the front of the frame and the glass, and another would be the distance from the inside profile of the frame to the inside of the opening in the back of the frame, if that makes any sense. So I don't want to remove too much because then it's likely that the frame will break. Also, these pieces of wood have some saw marks on them. They basically have a couple edges that are good and two edges that are kind of bad or rough. And I don't want to spend all this time sanding these saw marks off this board if I don't have to. See, those brown marks are from the saw blade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my corner chunk out of those 2 bad sides. That way I have less to sand and less work to do to finish it. Again, a little bit of planning of operations that'll save me time in the long run. So I messed up. And I like to show my mistakes on these videos because you'll probably make the same kind of mistake. So here's what the blade did, right? Now, this distance is great. That's about what I was expecting. But I have the blade set too deep. I don't want to take that much out. It's going to make the frame too weak. If this is the front of the frame and the glass is going to set against this back edge, I want this distance to be a little thicker so that I have some meat for the nail to bite into when I'm going to miter these. Now that's easy enough to do because all I need to do is drop the blade down maybe 1/4 of an inch lower. And I can still use this piece of wood. I started with my short piece, so I can still use this. It'll just be a little weaker, but maybe I'll use this for the short sections of the frame. Anyway. Now you can see the difference. From dropping the blade down inside the saw, this is what I want. Now I can set the blade to come right to here, right to that corner, and meet that cut, and it'll just pull that out. And I can use the same setting for this. I'll just have a little notch inside my frame. You'll see what I mean there in a minute. Now you may also have noticed that when I made that cut, I switched to the wooden push stick. And the reason for that is I was going to cut through it because I knew that as I pushed the end of that board over the blade was going to cut through the end of my push stick. So whenever you're doing this kind of operation, use these old homemade wooden push sticks. They work just as well. You can cut a little notch through them, and then once that gets too torn up, I'll just make another one. Now I have to set up the saw for the other dimension. Raise the blade up until it's at about 5/8 of an inch. Tighten the turn screw. And now I want my fence to be at about 1/2 inch. And I was at about 5/8 of an inch a moment ago. So now what that's going to do is that's going to mean that my featherboard is tighter. So I need to loosen my featherboard just a bit so that I'm not fighting my workpiece through the saw. I still want it to be snug, but I don't want it to be so tight that I'm fighting it, because once I come out the other end, I could suddenly jerk past and have an accident. Now the last thing, before I start the saw up, is I'm going to want to be very particular about where the blade is in relation to the last cut that I make. Because if I do it the wrong way around, I'm going to ruin everything I did. So I want to make sure that the groove is on the top, on this side of the fence. So that means I have to spin this one around. And what I like to do when I'm doing this kind of operation is I get everything laid out on the top of the table exactly the way that I need it. And then once it's all set up, I turn on the vacuum and I'm good to go. So now, as you can see, I have two pieces of wood here. I have my scrap or cutoff piece, and then I have my frame style. Now that is ready to be mitered and made into a picture frame.